property had always carried an air of quiet defiance against the community around it. Unlike the manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and cookie-cutter facades that stretched down the cul-de-sacs of the subdivision, this land stood apart, both in appearance and in spirit. A wide spread of acres lined with tall oaks, marsh grass along its edges, and an old farmhouse at the center, it gave off a sense of timelessness that the Homeowners Association despised but could never quite touch. The man who owned it had purchased the land years before the HOA had even existed. He was meticulous, not only in the way he maintained the farmhouse, but in how he secured every detail of his property's paperwork. When neighbors were told to paint their shutters a compliant shade of beige, he smirked from his porch, knowing his deed placed him beyond their reach. What no one in the HOA yet realized was that his deed was not just old, it was backed by protections that made it untouchable by any local governing body. But HOAs thrive on control. Their board members, most of them retirees with too much time and a taste for intimidation, had been watching the land for months. They saw it as a blemish on their carefully curated neighborhood. To them, it was an eyesore, a place where property values might drop simply because it did not fit the sterile, uniform look they demanded. Rumors spread through board meetings that if they didn't act soon, the farmhouse would become a precedent for others to rebel. That was something they would never allow. It started with letters. Folded notices slipped into mailbox, citing supposed violations, an unapproved structure here, an overgrown hedge there. The landowner ignored them. He knew the HOA had no jurisdiction over him. Each notice found its way into the trash without a second thought. Then came the warnings at his door, where board members, puffed up with self-importance, demanded compliance. Again, he told them nothing, gave them nothing, let them stew in their frustration. The tension simmered until it boiled over one humid afternoon in late summer. A crew of hired men, faces unfamiliar, wearing reflective vests and hard hats, marched onto the land. Trucks idled at the edge of the property, their engines grumbling like impatient beasts. These weren't landscapers politely trimming hedges. They carried bowl cutters, chainsaws, and rolls of orange fencing. The HOA board members stood nearby, smugly overseeing the operation, as though they were generals leading a charge. The landowner watched from his porch, silent but seething. He had anticipated this moment, though perhaps not so brazenly. Breaking onto private property was enforcement. It was trespassing. It was thuggery under thin-veiled HOA authority. The men cut to the fence at the property's edge, dragging it aside like it was nothing more than trash. Chainsaws roared to life, their blades biting into branches of century-old oaks. Stakes were hammered into ground, marking new lines as if the land could be redrawn by their will alone. Every sound echoed like an insult. The tearing of roots, the metallic clang of fencing, the laughter of board members who believed they had finally won. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some curious, some horrified, but none daring to intervene. This wasn't a request for compliance anymore. It was an invasion. But what the HOA didn't know was that the landowner had already prepared for this. His deed wasn't just a dusty legal document. It was bound by federal designation, tied to historic and environmental protections that superseded local authority. The farmhouse and the surrounding land were listed in a federal registry, granting them immunity from the petty demands of neighborhood boards. The men with chainsaws had no idea that every branch they cut, every foot they stepped, was stacking violations not against the homeowner, but against themselves and the HOA that sent them. Cameras mounted on the property's corners recorded everything. Paperwork, sealed and notarized, lay in a fireproof box inside the farmhouse, waiting for the day it would need to be pulled out like a sword. On that hot afternoon, as sawdust filled the air and the smug faces of board members glowed with satisfaction, the landowner finally stepped off his porch. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply walked the boundary of his land, his presence calm but deliberate, watching each unlawful move unfold. His silence unnerved them more than any confrontation could have. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over property, the HOA thugs had no idea they weren't dismantling an eyesore. They were building a case against themselves. The board thought they had made the first strike. In reality, they had just walked into the homeowner's trap. The next morning, the property bore scars of the intrusion. Branches lay scattered across the grass, Orange fencing ran in jagged lines, and a section of the boundary fence hung limply where the bolt cutters had torn through. It looked less like improvement and more like vandalism. But the landowner didn't rush to clean it up. He wanted the evidence untouched, each broken board and severed branch standing as proof of what had been done. The HOA board members, emboldened by their act, gathered in the clubhouse later that day. They congratulated themselves, boasting about how they had finally put the stubborn landowner in his place. They imagined him fuming, powerless, and cornered. What they didn't realize was that the homeowner was already preparing his counterattack, and unlike their petty notices, his response would carry weight that extended far beyond their suburban bubble. That evening, he spread the deed across his kitchen table. The parchment was older than most of the houses in the neighborhood, its language formal and precise. It traced back decades, a chain of ownership that predated the HOA by generations. More importantly, stapled to the deed was a certificate of federal protection. The property had been designated as both historically significant and environmentally sensitive. The oak grove it hacked into, protected under a federal conservation clause. The marshy edge of the land, classified as a wetland habitat under the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers. He knew the HOA had no clue about this. They operated under the assumption that their bylaws trumped everything. But federal protections were immovable, untouchable, and absolute. No amount of neighborhood votes or petty intimidation could override them. The landowner gathered his files, cross-referenced statutes, and drafted letters. His tone was calm, measured, but devastatingly sharp. The first letter went to the HOA board itself, delivered by certified mail. It outlined the trespassing, the damage, and protections they had violated. Attached were copies of the deed and federal designations. Each line was a reminder that their supposed authority was meaningless here. The second letter went to the county sheriff's office, accompanied by video evidence. The third, the most devastating, was addressed to the U.S. Department of the Interior and the Army Corps of Engineers, alerting them to unauthorized destruction on federally protected land. Meanwhile, the HOA board's arrogance only grew. They sent out a community-wide email, framing the landowner as non-compliant and painting themselves as protectors of property values. They claimed the land was being brought up to standard and hinted at fines they intended to impose. Their confidence was blinding. They had no idea they were walking into a storm of legal consequences. Days passed. The board strutted about the neighborhood, proud of their supposed victory. But then, the first cracks appeared. A county deputy arrived at the clubhouse one afternoon, carrying a stack of papers thicker than any violation notice the HOA had ever sent. The deputy's presence wasn't casual. It was official. He served the board with notice of investigation for trespassing and property damage. The board was stunned. Their smug smiles faltered as they realized the landowner hadn't been bluffing. The deputy explained that the homeowner had filed not only with the sheriff but with federal authorities. Words like criminal trespass and federal property hung in the air like storm clouds. The men and women who had once barked demands at their neighbors now sat silent, pale-faced, and fidgeting in their seats. But the blows didn't stop there. A week later, representatives from the Army Corps of Engineers and the state's environmental agency arrived on the property. They surveyed the land, photographed the damage, and took statements. The chainsaw cuts on the oak trees weren't just unsightly. They were violations of federal conservation law. The marshland disturbance was another strike. Each infraction carried fines not in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. And the responsibility didn't fall on the hired thugs with hard hats. It fell squarely on the HOA board members who had ordered the incursion.